We've all been there. You have a huge gap on the start line just for someone to take it with 10 seconds to go, completely ruining your start and your race. In this video, we're breaking down how two-time world champion Nick Thompson was able to turn a bad start into a race win at the 2018 World Championships in Aarhus. Let's do it. Setting the scene, this is race 8 of the 2018 World Championships. This is the first Olympic qualifier for the 2020 Olympics. We're in the second race of Goldfleet. Nick had just had 4 bad races in a row and was sitting in 14th overall. So I'm sure he was thinking to himself that he really needs to start trying to make something happen here. He's got a couple of his teammates breathing down his neck for Olympic qualification, so the pressure is really high. The conditions were 8 to 10 knots and sunny, but Aarhus is actually located in quite an enclosed bay, so the wind can be quite shifty. And in the previous race, we saw the right-hand side of the course being heavily favored. In this race now, we'll see they're starting under a black flag. And this is where we get the first glimpse of Nick. We see him, this is Matt Wern just here, and then Luke Elliott, so second and third at the time. And then this is Nick here, just tacking below Luke Elliott and Matt Wern, roughly in the middle of the line. And we see him just again here. This is Nick, 211921, hanging around in the middle of the line. Really nice space here in the middle. No one really getting in his way at the moment with a minute to go. Looking at where Nick is starting here, we can gain 2 insights into his plan for this race. The first one is that he wants to start in the middle on the black flag start. Coming off the back of 4 races, I don't think he wants to take any chances with getting a black flag here. So he's a lot more comfortable starting in the middle where there's this huge line sag at the moment, and he knows it's going to be very hard for the race committee at either end of the line to spot him. The second thing is that the boat end is very favored here, and the right-hand side worked in the last race. Nick knows that. But what starting in the middle suggests to me is that he is planning on the breeze swinging left, or thinks that the breeze might actually just be oscillating and it's not a purely right-hand track. And he's setting himself up here so that he can start on the lifted tack, which is starboard, and then he can continue. And then if the breeze does swing back to the left, he gains on all these boats who are starting towards the committee boat end. So that gives him the maximum number of options when it comes to shifts throughout the first upwind. So Nick is still here and he has a lot of space around him, but you start to see a few more boats starting to bail out of going for the committee boat end and work their way down towards the middle of the line to find their own gap. And just here now, this is where you see Luke Elliott moving down and starting to go below Nick, who's just popping out here. And he's now putting pressure on Nick to avoid him to windward. So now just a few seconds off the start, this is Nick just here, 21. You can see he's getting lee bowed by Luke Elliott there after having his gap stolen. Absolutely worst outcome for him here, because really the only options are hang in there, try to survive, or tack out and try to get out into clear air on the right-hand side of the fleet, whilst also sailing on the knocked tack port. A couple of minutes off the start, we can see Nick here, red boat in 27th, well back on the leaders. Luke Elliott and Matt Wern have already tacked out to go to the right, and Sam Meach and Pavlos Kontitas, who were both in the top 3 at the time, are still heading towards the left. Nick is in this really tight lane here with a boat close to windward and to leeward, and really he has no option but to try and survive here. At this point, a bit under half of the fleet have already tacked, so Nick's best bet here is just to stay on starboard, and then when the boats immediately above him and below him start tacking, that's when he might look to start tacking with the rest of the fleet. At this point, a couple of minutes later, Nick has dropped even further down the fleet to be ranked 32 here. You can see Pavlos Contides has now taken the lead, and he's extending because he's in a 15 to 20 degree left-hand shift here. So most of the fleet is now starting to tack onto port to make advantage of that left-hand shift. But Nick is still stuck here with this one boat just above him, preventing him from tacking. Moving into the second third of the upwind, Nick has now tacked onto port here in 35th position, so well down in the fleet. But there's two key tactical principles which Nick's positioning here is showing us. The first one, cross them when you can, but don't let them cross you. So in this case, the majority of boats leading on the left here have already tacked to port, and Nick has chosen to tack before they can cross him, which still leaves him room to gain on them later on in the race. The second tactical principle, tack ahead and to leeward. So you can see here, there's this group of 4 boats that Nick has now tacked in a lee bow position on. So that both puts them under pressure and makes sure they stay behind him. And also now heading back to the middle of the course in any case where the wind starts shifting back to the right, Nick now gains even more on those boats. And the other thing which is really crucial here, and which is one of the key reasons why Nick is able to work his way back through the fleet here, is where he tacks. You can see here he has this huge gap below him, and there's no boats above him taking his air. So he's been really smart about choosing where to tack, in that he has all this free space below him to sail as fast as possible and no one blocking his air to windward. So he's really prioritizing clean air in making his comeback. I think the other thing Nick's positioning here also tells us about his mindset is about the patience he has when he's trying to work his way through the fleet. So he could have tacked at any point over here when the breeze was already starting to go left, but he chose to wait until all of these leaders were starting to tack, and he also chose to wait until he has the best gap where he'll have the most space to sail freely for the rest of the upwind. Transitioning into the final third of the upwind, you can now start seeing why Nick's tack positioning was super crucial in helping him work his way up to 10th in the fleet. He was able to sail the whole way on port tack when in clear air with no boats getting in his way and sailing as fast as he can. And there's actually something surprising which you'll see at the end of this upwind about his boat speed. But if you compare his track here to that of some of the other main competitors in the regatta at this point, you can see they've done multiple tacks throughout this upwind, either to reposition or find a better spot to make the most of that left-hand shift, whereas Nick was just able to continue on port for that whole lifted tack leg. And now you'll start seeing where Nick is starting to plan his approach to the top mark, and how he's also thinking about another key tactical principle when it comes to oscillating breezes and making comebacks in big fleets. And the next key tactical principle is to treat the final shift as persistent. What that means is, in a persistent shift, you try to get as far to the side of that shift as possible to maximize your gains. Even though the wind here isn't persistently shifting to the left, Nick would be very in phase with the shifts now and know that it's likely to stay in the left for the rest of the upwind, and particularly by the time he gets to the top mark. So Nick here is already up to 4th place, and he has absolutely no reason to tack here on paper. He has a gap below him, a gap above him. He's on the same tack as the leaders, but what he's doing here is he's wanting to reposition himself further to the left of the fleet, and particularly to the left of all these boats here, in the case that he can gain even more coming into the top mark if the breeze shifts even further left. So he's going to tack onto the very headed tack for a short moment, leverage himself to the left-hand side of the fleet to then try and gain more coming into the top mark. Coming into the top mark, we see Pavlos Kontides rounding in first. Then he's closely followed by Filip Jurisic, Tom Burton, and then Nick rounding in fourth. Looking at the stats from the first upwind, they tell a lot of the story. The first one is the distance sailed. We see Nick here sailing the second shortest course out of anyone in the fleet, second only to the leader at the top mark, Pavlos Kontides. And what's actually really interesting is even though Nick had a very good lane for that whole length on port and was able to sail as fast as he likes or can, when we filter by speed over ground, if we ignore this sailor, we actually see Nick is very far down the list when it comes to average speed over the leg. He's one of actually the slowest average speeds over ground throughout that first upwind. But despite that, he actually is the highest VMG sailor for that whole leg, just thanks to the fact he sailed such a short course over that first upwind. So even though Nick does have world-class speed, that's not actually the reason why he was able to make the comeback in this first upwind. He was able to make it because of his positioning and his ability to understand the wind and where he needs to tack and put himself as a result. So even though Nick is now up to fourth and in a great position, we're not done with his comeback yet. Coming out of the top mark, we see Pavlos Kontides, the leader, and Nick going on this pretty broad reach here. This is very common, especially in light winds. And what they're trying to do here is avoid what's known as the cone of silence here, which is this area directly below the top mark where there's all this dirty air from the fleet and you just go backwards by sitting in it. And the fleet just tends to like swamp around you if you get stuck in it. But even though they're both heading in that direction, what Nick does next is really crucial for how he ends up taking the lead in this race. So now that they've worked their way through the cone of silence or beyond it, we now see the next most critical moment of Nick's comeback. What you can see here is Nick now starting to work his way back towards the middle of the course or back towards the rum line, whereas Pavlos is still continuing out on this broad reach angle, and we see Nick now coming back towards the middle of the course and is the most centered boat of the top five. And this all comes back to the principle of sailing the shortest course. At this point, Nick would be looking behind him and seeing that there's all this space out here where there's no boats which can give him dirty air, and he's looking to sail the shortest or quickest route back to the marks and get as close to the rum line as possible whilst doing so in clear air. So you need to be really conscious of the boats behind you and knowing when you will have clear air on the leg back towards the center of the course. So it's now at this point where Pavlos needs to start working his way back towards the marks that we finally see Nick overtake him and gain the lead of this race. Comeback complete. And I think this moment also talks a lot about Nick's patience. When you're in Nick's position here, the one furthest towards the middle of your group, it can be very tempting to sail back out towards Pavlos and try and lock into the gains that he appears to be making on the side of the course when he's sailing faster. But if you just have the patience to wait it out until you get to the bottom of the course, where he will eventually need to come back towards you and sail all this extra distance, that's where you're going to make your gains from having sailed the shortest course. Looking at the stats from the first downwind, similar principles to the first upwind stand out. The first one, Nick had one of the shortest distances sailed by anyone in the fleet. And even though he had excellent boat speed on this downwind, he wasn't the fastest. Pavlos was the second fastest speed over ground. But just thanks to that distance, or the really short distance Nick sailed, he was the second highest VMG here. So that just does go to show that you don't need to have the fastest boat speed on the course to make these massive comebacks, but you do need to position yourself very well and really focus on the key strategies and tactics that are going to help you sail the shortest course. So that's it. Nick's comeback is complete. He sailed himself from the mid 30s in the fleet on the first upwind all the way to leading the race by the time he finished the first downwind. Watching Nick sail here, he showed us 3 golden rules for turning a bad start into a comeback and a race win. The first one, clear air is your best friend, and you absolutely need to prioritize clear air above everything else and focus on finding and staying in clear air. The second one, patience beats panic. Throughout these 2 legs, we saw times where Nick was very, very patient and just waited for the right moment rather than rushing into maneuvers, which would lead to strategic mistakes. And third thing, trust the fundamentals. Nick stuck with some very core tactical and strategic rules of thumb throughout these 2 legs that helped him sail the shortest course and get him to the front of the fleet. If you want to learn more about comebacks, tactical principles, or how to sail as fast as Nick, click the link below to head to my Substack and subscribe. I send out weekly articles on things like boat speed, tactics, psychology, fitness, all with the aim of helping you get 1% better every week. So along with these videos, go over there, hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time.